Hello and welcome back to the second of two videos for this week. I apologize for the abrupt end of the video where we talk about the essay topics. Something happened to my computer, everything just crapped out, so here I am starting again. Okay, so in this video we want to take a look at modules 9 and 10. 9 on the political economy of the Scottish Enlightenment, and number 10, module 10 on Marx and the Age of Revolution. Okay, so what or who were the Scottish Enlightenment? Well, it was part of a period of time in the early 18th century. So we're looking at sort of the late 1700s and sort of moving, early 1700s to the late. And it was characterized by a remarkable production in philosophical ideas, intellectual debates and discussions, legal changes, architectural changes, scientific accomplishments, especially industrialization. And the Scottish Enlightenment shared very similar characteristics to the Enlightenment that was happening in Western Europe in the following ways. They were humanists for the most part, because they were interested in the human being, right? The citizen, subject, human being living in society. They also had a mechanistic or causal understanding of the world, much like Hobbes had, or Descartes and other Enlightenment thinkers. They were very rational in their thinking. They had a very strong emphasis on the use of reason, on human reason and its importance, especially in rejecting any kind of authority that that could get dismantled, right, through the use of reason, critical reasoning. And this is, again, something that Descartes had done. But finally, what kind of characterizes them specifically is their rather optimistic view of the world if we are reasonable creatures, if we use reason to effect positive change in both our human nature and in society in general, we will be better off. So there was a real emphasis placed on the value of reason, the gift of reason. So the two individuals I want to look at in this particular module, Adam Ferguson and Adam Smith. We're going to start with Adam Smith first, since he wrote first. He was a philosopher, a moral philosopher in particular, which is interesting because these thinkers, however associated with sociology, kind of budding anthropologists and political economists, they're writing at a time when these fields haven't even developed, let alone, come into being. So the ideas they're presenting are quite different from typical philosophy, strongly based in moral philosophy, but using that to examine all of the changes in society, the economic changes, political and legal and so on, all these changes. And Smith believed that the invention of machinery was destined to replace human labor, right, and to increase material production. He looked at that as a good thing because the menial tasks that, especially repetitive tasks, were now going to be done by machines, and we could increase productivity. And by increasing productivity, we would then raise the standard of living for the average person. Goods will be made cheaply and be cheaper, hopefully, be more plentiful and available. So the standard of living was clearly improving in Scotland, which is why Ferguson and Smith and others saw it optimistically, right, as a good thing. So Ferguson sort of analyzed modern commercial society, or what was later called civic society or civil society. And what he did do, though, as a moral philosopher, is he critiqued the abandonment of civic and communal virtues. So the virtues that held a community together, a family together, the bonds of friendship, those were being eroded and undermined by industrialization. As much as it was a good thing, the price we were paying for industrialization and material production was an erosion of civic and communal virtues. So on the one hand, it was good in terms of productivity, bad on the other hand, because it was eroding our relationships with ourselves, with each other, with higher beings even, as we'll see with Smith and further on. So the problem lay in trying to make sense of this new kind of modernity, which had been brought on by the Industrial Revolution. There was nothing really to compare it to. Nothing had changed the world so significantly as this. So what was happening for Ferguson was that the traditions that we had had in our lives up to this point were now being undermined. And so the end of a tradition doesn't always mean that the concept loses its power. It just means that it loses its force, right? Its living force, its reality in the world around us. And that is what Smith saw was kind of being eroded by, at this point, not so much capitalism as industrialization. It was changing everything. It was now forcing people to show up to work at a certain time. And so now you had to live and work by the clock. The clock was everything. And once that factory whistle blew, you were allowed to go home, but you knew you had to come back the next day. So rather than a much more sort of relaxed world in which you could live, you'd show up to work, whatever that was, you had to be there at a certain time because you were going to replace someone who's ready to go home. So it was changing everything. Now, the other person, Adam Smith, considered to be the father of free market economic theory, he was also somewhat optimistic, much like Ferguson and the others, and he thought that rational self-interest and competition would lead to economic prosperity, which it was. It was doing that. So rational self-interest was, okay, I wish to make money. I wish to work or create these products and sell them. And I know that others are going to, so I'm going to sell them in a competitive way so that I don't undercut my neighbor. I do it in such a way that I don't destroy their livelihoods as well. So the idea of competition and rational self-interest and industrialization for Smith had to be tempered with morality. You could not lose your moral compass in the middle of industrialization. Otherwise, there would be some serious problems. So certain economists look at Smith's idea of the invisible hand, which is a kind of a twofold thing. On the one hand, the invisible hand, no pun intended, discusses and talks about the notion of someone looking to buy a product invisibly sort of brought together by this invisible hand with someone who's looking to sell a product. So the buyer and the seller are brought together invisibly or by an invisible hand to meet each other and to exchange goods and services for money. Now, there was also this idea that an individual, rationally self-interested, could pursue those desires to make money, and the self-interest is, of course, to do better. And providing your moral compass is intact and your sense of justice is intact, you would unintentionally also promote the greater good of society. So there's a kind of utilitarian view of the invisible hand here, that someone who has a strong moral compass engages in business activities through industrialization, but in so doing, their desire to make money actually benefits the entire society by making these goods more available to people. That's the way that Smith saw it. Now, he also, and this is the important part in the second half of his book, The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, he also warned that a business-dominated political system allows for businesses and industry to influence politics to their own ends. And this is an issue that we have absolutely, in our midst in 2023. Across North America, most of Western Europe, the idea that the political system under which we live is more or less controlled by business interests because they have lobby groups and they donate to political parties. They expect favors and they have got tons of money because, let's face it, few of them ever pay taxes. So they have lots of money set aside to influence political decisions. And Smith warns, if we allow that to happen, then the idea of a free market is gone because it is no longer a free market. So that's why that moral aspect is so important to point out in both Smith and Ferguson. They knew that without that moral compass, that the division of labor and rational self-interest and all the rest of it would literally get thrown out the window. And you would end up with a monopoly of interests controlling government to create laws in their favor. So when businesses are given, special privileges and protections from government, game over. And we are in big trouble. So that is a remarkable idea that Smith is presenting to us in terms of thinking of industry at such an early stage. It literally is just starting. In fact, the steam engine had only been invented in, I believe, 1640. So About 100 years later, industry just begins. But here it is. Smith is warning us. A free market is a good thing, but it has to be truly free. Otherwise, you will end up with business interests that are controlling it. So we see Ferguson's commitment to moral virtues, Smith as well. And Smith was also ready to believe in the innate goodness of human beings and the notion that success for a few individuals would mean, generally speaking, the success of all of society. So, and again, a kind of utilitarian viewpoint, the success of some equals the success of all, right? A rising tide raises all boats. That's the metaphor typically here. But the issue here is what happens to morality and goodness. We need to have a system that will privilege those and support them and protect them. But Smith warns, as much as the division of labor is a necessary part of industrialization, he says the division of labor, along with its free play of economic forces, actually ends up weakening the link between God and various political, economic, and scientific functions that drive modernity forward. The link with religion, the theological thinking, and God is undermined, right, is eroded through modernity. And here's how it does it. Modernity is characterized by the following issues: the questioning and rejection of tradition, including religion, the prioritization of the individual, right, rather than the collective or the family or the community, freedom and formal equality. People are free to choose, what to believe in or not, and equality in terms of everyone is capable potentially of participating in the generation of wealth in that particular society. But ultimately, what is happening is, as all of these traditions are being eroded, we end up confusing social progress with technological advancements. So technological advancements, greater amounts of divisions of labor, greater amounts of industrialization, doesn't necessarily mean that society is progressing in the traditional way that we expected. Greater amounts of freedom, greater amounts of liberty, greater amounts of independent thinking. So we're mistaking social progress for technological advancements. And this is something that becomes much more important as we move on into the 19th century or the 1800s with Marx and the Age of Revolution. So this is in Module 10. And of course, these two periods are linked very intimately, primarily because of industrialization and capitalization, modernity, the erosion of traditional values. And the one thinker that really was the last one to try to tie all this together was Hegel. But once he died, his disciples, and I use that facetiously, but his adherents, right, his followers, kind of fell into disagreement over what Hegel meant, right? What would Hegel mean in the future? So what happens very quickly is we have two groups of Hegelians. We have the older or right Hegelians, not that they're correct, but right-leaning, right-wing. And those Hegelians are going, the world is perfect as it is. We just need to wrap it up in a nice little pink bow. There you go. Everything's good. Then we have the younger or left Hegelians. And these are the people I want to look at in a few moments. They were younger, more radical, and they wanted to re-engage with Hegel and find those moments in Hegel's thinking where he is critical, where he does provide those kinds of dialectical tools to take apart society, but not necessarily put it back together again the same way, but take it apart to examine its interrelationships. What are the components that tie together society, economics, politics? How do they interrelate? And can we improve that interrelationship? So those are the people I want to look at here. The two main ones, Ludwig Feuerbach and Karl Marx. So Feuerbach was a left Hegelian. He was more of a kind of theologian / proto-anthropologist, and he decided to thoroughly critique his own society. And he wanted to do it by critically, re-engaging with Hegelianism and Hegel's thoughts. And so what they wanted to do was to reconstitute Hegel in a more radical form. Even though Hegel was not someone that wished to change the world, but merely interpret it, those thinkers found within Hegel's thought those moments, right? Those moments where that critical thinking was at its absolute highest peak, and Hegel was busy unpacking things. Now, one of the main issues for the German thinkers, Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, David Moses, and others that we don't talk about in the class, but they are also left Hegelians. For them, the issue was religion. Religion was important because what was at stake here were not just questions of religious doctrine. It was a fact that it controlled the moral and political order, much like it did in France in the 1700s. It continued to do so in Germany in the 1800s. So to talk about religion was to talk about social and political order. And so Feuerbach began writing, arguing that traditional religion and philosophy were flawed because they needed to be replaced with a new kind of philosophy that would place the human being at its center. And if you do that, it will lead to its emancipation. Human beings will be emancipated from these restrictive forms of philosophy and religion so that they can now flourish, right, and become authentic beings, not thwarted or distorted human beings that are not fulfilling their finality, their full potential. And Feuerbach looked at traditional religion and philosophy as being flawed in this way, that it was crippling us. So he thought a radical redemption of humanity, to redeem humanity by eliminating all forms of oppressive consciousness. Now, Feuerbach is writing at a time when, again, industry and capitalism is not really full on at this point. Industrialization really doesn't hit Germany till about the 1840s, and Feuerbach is writing kind of just before that period. So he's not talking about industrialization the way that the Scottish Enlightenment did, but looking at how religion was doing something quite similar. Although he was claiming to glue together communities and families and people, he thought it was doing it in a way that was distorting our full humanity. So to redeem ourselves, we would have to reject all forms of oppressive consciousness that were keeping humanity from realizing itself, right, its full spiritual grandeur. So for Feuerbach, God and truth, right, the objects of religion and philosophy were not really the real objects. It was human beings. But we were talking about it in such an indirect, veiled, metaphorical kind of way that we were actually hiding from ourselves the fact that we can be perfect beings. And so Feuerbach thought that these disciplines, religion and philosophy, should and had been talking about human beings, but in a kind of coded language that was not addressing the truth of the matter, which was the truth of human existence as being crippled by these oppressive institutions, these oppressive forms of thinking. So this is essentially what Feuerbach was all about. Redeem human beings by rejecting oppressive consciousnesses, religious or philosophical or otherwise. And it's that idea that Marx originally sort of picked up. Now, by 1844, Marx had pretty well rejected most of the ideas from Feuerbach, simply because there were too many issues. He was not being a real materialist. He hadn't fully disengaged from Hegel. He hadn't formulated a truly revolutionary thought, because really, for Marx, Feuerbach had just sort of rejigged the material that was there. So Marx thought, you know what? We need to take up a criticism of politics completely. So what he did in his political philosophy was what he called transformational criticism. So to transform something, transform the world, transform our way of thinking, transform our ability to go out and act upon these ideas in the world. So for Marx, Feuerbach had applied Hegelian philosophy of religion to the world, and by 1844, Marx decided, no, we're going to leave this behind. We're going to go into straightforward Kritik. So Kritik in German, criticism. This is what he wanted to do. And not only did he want to critique everything, because to critique religion at this point in the 1840s is to critique every part of our existence. Because religion was so much a part of our everyday life and our humanity, as well as our institutions, to critique religion was to try to critique and dismantle virtually every other institution that followed suit. So, in doing so, much like Feuerbach, Marx also came back to the reality, or at least the distorted reality, of our true human essence. And that's on the one hand what he wanted to do, but on the other, the theoretical existence of individuals through religion, through science. So we see here two different things. There is the reality of us as human beings, like actual living, authentic human beings on the one hand, and on the other hand, this sort of fictitious theoretical version of ourselves that exists in religion and science and philosophy as well. And this is what Marx wanted to point out. And he says, okay, at the very least, in the reality part, right, on the one hand, our essence as human beings is being compromised and corrupted by industrial capitalism. And what he's saying is the Industrial Revolution, almost as a kind of new religion, and its accompanying political dimension, the very thing that Smith warned us about, because it shouldn't be political, it should remain economic, was actually turning individuals into machines, into cogs in a wheel. And this was the inherent issue. This was the essence of Marx's ideas, that individuals are being stripped of their humanity, of their human essence, of their species being, and all the rest of it. All those things are being destroyed and undermined by capitalism and industrialization. Now, how does that work and what does it look like? Well, one of the key ideas in Marx, not only in this notion of the distortion of our human essence, is the fact that in capitalism, we suffer from alienation. So alienation is this disconnection, right? It emerges originally out of a lower unity that we may feel sort of separated from ourselves and our not only a way of life, but we kind of lose our way in the world, and eventually we figure out where we're going and we reconcile with ourselves. With Marx, he says, no, the way that Hegel had it figured out, there's somewhere we're going to come back and find ourselves. He says, not in capitalism. It's only going to get worse. We will alienate ourselves more and more. We are going to separate individuals from each other and from themselves. And he writes, the worker sinks to the level of a commodity, to a thing, and becomes indeed the most wretched of commodities, that the wretchedness of the worker is in inverse proportion to the power and magnitude of his production. So the more he or she produces, the less they are of a human being. And of course, at the time he's writing, this is the time when there are 60-hour work weeks. There are kids working in factories. If you ever want to read a real horror show, read chapter 2 of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, The Workday. And all Marx did was he went to the British Library and he pulled out all the accident reports from a given factory. It's a horror show. It is brutal what was happening in factories at the time he was writing. But this was just accidents. He said, look, spiritually and intellectually and in terms of our essence, it's being undermined. It's being destroyed from the inside by industrialization and by capitalism. So this is really what he was talking about. Alienated labor estranges, in other words, distances us, individuals, from our divine nature that Feuerbach was trying to salvage originally 20 years prior. Our life activity. We have no more life. We simply turn into passive consumers that sleep just long enough to be able to get enough rest to go back to work so that we spend the weekends shopping and buying stuff. So our life activity is now dictated by, passive consumer interests, our own species being, who we are as human beings, our connectedness to our family, our community, to something greater than ourselves, and finally to our fellow workers. So we are constantly eroded and distant more and more from our divinity, our activities as human beings, our understanding of what a human being is, and from the workers that we are working with. So the end result is not looking so good. So that's essentially, now this is an early version of Marx, or at least Marx between about 1843 to 1847 roughly. From this point on, Marx becomes a complete political economist, and does continue to work writing theory of surplus value, capital, and so on. I wanted to present to you an early version of Marx that links really well with the other thinkers that we've looked at. But certainly what Marx has to say really piggybacks on what Feuerbach had originally said in the early 1840s and the 1830s. And those two were also responding to some of the ideas which had been presented by the Scottish Enlightenment, and their understanding that without a moral compass, but without the idea of a true free economy, or free economy and a free market, we're going to be in big trouble. And by the time Marx is writing, we are in trouble, and he already can see it. Okay, so that is essentially modules 9 and 10. We'll continue along for the next couple of weeks. Lots of time for the essay. Any issues that you have, please contact me and we can work these things out. But your essay will be due on August 6th, on the Sunday. So in the meantime, take care, and we shall see each other very soon. Bye-bye.